is my place, and I am welcome.
Take it away, Wendy.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so pleased to be back with you today. So on the 6th, we would have celebrated Myrtle's 176th birthday. And on the 22nd, we would celebrate Charles's 167th birthday. So happy birthday to Mama and Papa Charles Fillmore. So as I was preparing this, I realized that our power for this month of will really fits in with the story of the Fillmores and how they came to develop the Unity movement. So there's a booklet available at unity.org that outlines our themes for this month, and our affirmation for the month of August is, I use my power of will to choose, to commit, and to be willing. I'm basing part of this talk on a booklet that I've used before in this theme year called Discover Your God-Given Potential. It's also available at unity.org. You might have to do a search for it. It came out in 2010, and so being a bit older, sometimes it doesn't get archived in the same places as some of the others. But just to give you an overview of what the 12 powers are. So if this is new to you, let me just give you a quick summary. The idea is that this is a way of expressing our spiritual faculties, our spiritual gifts, those parts of us that are not really human. It's something divine. It's something that's expressed in and through us, and is that part of us that we in Unity call the Christ. And by Christ, we don't mean a specific person. We use that term as an abbreviation for the wholeness of our divinity, the wholeness of that part of us that is eternal, universal, and immortal. So in dealing with the will, we have it centered up here in the forebrain. On the other side of the brain, in the forehead, there is understanding. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. That was last month's power. And we will go through and discuss how this idea of will works in our lives. And in this booklet, they give us 7 steps, sort of expanding understanding. And what I realized as I was preparing the Fillmores and trying not to duplicate myself, because those of you who know me know that I love to talk about the Fillmores and how Unity was founded and some of the really neat things that they did to expand the ministry early on, like using radio pretty much before anybody else, like using telephone ministry pretty much before anybody else. But how much their personal will came into the expression of what became Unity. So the first step that the booklet talks about is willingness. So moving from a willfulness, that human desire that it's my way or the highway, into something where we align ourselves with a greater spiritual understanding. In this description, they talk about God's way. If you don't like the word God, you can replace it with oneness, the spirit, universal, whatever works for you. But the idea that if we're both human and physical, human and spiritual, so 2 halves of the coin, the third side of that coin is that place where we find balance between our human selves and our divine selves. And so the idea that we're moving a little bit more towards working through the divine and allowing those ideas to come through and be expressed in our human self, and discovering that when you can let go of your willfulness, that great things start to happen as you align yourself more with that divine side of yourself, your inner Christ. So let's talk about Myrtle first. She's actually the older of the 2, as I showed earlier. She was born in Pagetown. Her maiden name was Page. This was the family town. And as you can see, this was, I found this in the archives, and it just said Page relatives. That was the only description. No idea who these people are other than they are her relatives. Now, with all due respect, being a Methodist in the mid-1800s in the US would have been fairly restrictive. Your sense of theology, your sense of God's will really, indicated what you were going to do. And it was very much framed in, there were punishments if you didn't obey. And every so often we see a little bit of that pop out in Myrtle. even after unity is formed. She was insistent that there not be card playing on grounds. She was, when she wrote her second book for children, she actually had a character get ill. And one of the other adult characters says, well, if she's want to die, then that's God's will. And if she's healthy, that's the devil's will. And that is so out of alignment with what we teach in unity about good and evil and all of that. And that's a whole other Sunday talk. But the idea that she grew up in this idea of you couldn't really have a personal will, and the stringentness of that will that you were following was certainly something different than what she expressed later. Charles, on the other hand, was born in the wilds of Minnesota, just outside of St. Cloud. He had a younger brother who was 2 years younger, and his parents split. They lived 10 miles apart, and the two kids actually, they had joint custody, so they went back and forth between the parents. Charles, as some of you may recall from previous talks, had an accident as a child that left him injured and unable to function in a healthy way. His leg was injured, his hearing was injured, there were a number of things. And it's difficult to pin out what was part of his, the disease that came out of the treatments, because the treatments almost killed him. So he's in this place of, trying to be a kid and not being able to be a kid. So both of them kind of grow up in this atmosphere that's not particularly conducive to their well-being. Our second level is resolution. And this is when you become more aware of what direction you're going to take. This is where you become conscious of perhaps something that's calling your heart to do something or to be something. In the case of Myrtle, she had been told that she had tuberculosis, that it ran in the family, she was going to get sick, so don't bother making plans for your life because you're not going to live long enough to do them. But she said phooey on that, basically, and went and became a teacher. Now, at that point in time, that precluded her from getting married, for as soon as she got married, she would lose her teaching position. In some districts, the Board of Trustees actually had the authority to dictate who could come and call on you. And when you got engaged, your contract would be terminated. So anything that she did at that point was very much in keeping with her long-term plan, which was, I want to be with children. I want to teach children. So this was her direction, and she took the usual steps of getting trained and then finding a position. She lived with her brother while she worked initially. At this time, it wouldn't have been appropriate to live on her own. But she had the human sense of what she needed to do on the human plane to speak to this passion in her heart for looking after the children and educating them. Charles, on the other hand, here's Myrtle's graduation picture. Charles, on the other hand, had a number of jobs. His resume would be one of the longest that I would have to compose. And again, he had a sense of what he wanted to be. He wanted to be self-sufficient. He wanted to have work that he could do physically and not just be, sitting at a desk. He was a mule driver at one point and lost the load and the mules, but saved himself as they went over a precipice. So he too had this plan of what he wanted out of life. Now, in Charles's case, he didn't really have any religious teaching that we can find. There's not much mention of it. So he doesn't have that spiritual sense from an outer sense. I think he had something internal, but it was kind of dormant at that point. Our third level is training. So even though Charles and Myrtle have had training in the outer human form, they haven't had their inner training yet. They haven't found that capacity to understand a spiritual message within them. But we have to take the breath and re-educate ourselves and get ourselves into a place of being willing, being open to possibilities, being open to ideas that are so flippin' crazy. You want to shake your head and say, who, me? And I'm sure over time, as Charles and Myrtle progressed through the founding and growth of Unity, they may have had a couple times where they said, what the heck? Why me? This is mine to do, really? And I'm sure if you ask any Unity minister or licensed teacher, they will tell you there was a point at which they said, who, me, really? Are you kidding? So where it's about getting into that space of being receptive to the idea and understanding that there are not only physical things to do, whether it's going to school or participating in some kind of group, but also there's that training of getting our minds into the space of going first within and then without, the idea of connection within to that higher sense of self. This is a very early picture of Charles and Myrtle. Unfortunately, it was glued down, and you can see the glue has seeped through. But at this point in their lives, they're newly married, they're about to start a family. They haven't really got the idea yet. So they don't realize that they're in training, but actually they are, because they're about to have not only 2 sons, but Myrtle is about to get very ill. And what they found as they were trying to figure out how to feed their growing family, how to keep Myrtle healthy, and how to, make it work in the American West, before highways, before things were stabilized. And they were traveling a lot, and they were moving around, following the boom and bust of the real estate, which is kind of a natural cyclical kind of thing. Eventually, they will settle down. But as Myrtle gets sicker and sicker, they wonder if they need to move again. And their son Lowell writes of this period that if you had looked in their house, you would have seen boxes, bottles and bottles of lotions and potions, and anyone who had a cure, was welcome to come and make their demonstration to her, in the hopes, having 2 small children and being given a death sentence, that she would find a way to live longer. Our next step is obedience. Learning to be responsive to that inner voice, learning to listen to that inner voice. What I find really interesting is Myrtle seemed to be able to listen to that voice when she was awake, because we have a time where we know that she heard a speaker and she came out with a thought and she glommed onto it and she prayed over it, she meditated on it, she considered it, she worked with it for 2 years and eventually saw a healing. Charles, on the other hand, had to be reminded in a dream because his intellect was too busy during daytime to listen. And I find that really interesting, of the difference between them. And we see parallels in other stories of the difference between the male and the female brain and the male and the female understanding of these things. So as the understanding comes through with the willingness, we get to a point where we say, yes, I will do this. Yes, I am willing. So Myrtle had the thought from this lecture, I am a child of God and therefore I do not inherit sickness. Talk about a metaphysical bombshell. She had been told ever since her birth that she was going to have tuberculosis, she was going to get sick, she was going to die early, and everything seemed to be pointing to that happening. And yet here was this metaphysical bomb that just blew up her whole thinking and her whole awareness of who and what she was. Charles, on the other hand, took some more time to figure it out, but he's watching Myrtle. Myrtle's getting better. Myrtle is healing. So even his intellect can't ignore that. And he starts reading, he starts studying, and he comes up with this thought, in this battle, I will go to headquarters. If I am spirit and this God they talk so much about is spirit, we can somehow communicate, or the whole thing is a fraud. And that's where he gets into this idea of being willing to listen, being willing to go to headquarters, as we sort of condense this phrase into. The idea that there was something there and he was open and willing to pursue it. And he talks about being in the quiet for a while and not really feeling like he was getting anywhere. And I invite you, if you're working on your prayer life and having difficulty, please remember both of our co-founders took a while before they got it. It took them some time, it took them some practice, it took them willingness to be part of that process. The next step is government. So will now functions under Christ, his spiritual nature. In divine consciousness under God direction, you become invincible. Now, please don't go trying to fly or, lift a heavy car or something like that. But the idea that when you are in a place of willingness, a lot of the barriers that had appeared before suddenly disappear. They dissipate, and they are replaced with easy paths that make your pathway clear and smooth. And sometimes it comes up, there's a pothole, but the idea is to come back into that space, into that willingness, and into that understanding. Charles and Myrtle codified their willingness in their dedication and covenant. And this is a whole other Sunday talk, quite literally. But what they state in it, it's like a legal contract. This is what we are willing to do. This is what we expect in return. We expect that we will receive the health, that we will be taken care of financially, that we will do our part to share the message, to share the teachings, to be loving, and all sorts of things. And this is the whole idea of willing, to be able to stop and say, I am so willing. I am in such a place of willingness that I can put it to paper and make it look like a legal document. Because when you read it, if you gave this to any lawyer, they would say, well, you need to change this line to party of the first part and party of the second part. But otherwise, it fits that model. Surrender. Oh, the S word that we don't like in unity. But the idea that we stay with Jesus when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but yours be done. And by that, we're not saying some outer God insisting we do something. We are saying we are open to a bigger picture. We are open to being something greater than we can humanly imagine. If you had told me 5 years ago that I would be doing Zoom Sunday talks across Canada, I would have probably laughed because it seemed so ludicrous. But here I am. Next week, I will actually be speaking in Ontario and BC on the same day. So we have this whole thing of moving forward and getting to the point where instead of going into my way or the highway, we stop and we say, there is a better way to do this. There is an easier way to do this. And it involves my willingness to be in alignment with the greater power that we call God or oneness or spirit or whatever. So each of the Fillmores had a way of being willing. And again, this is a whole other talk altogether. But even Grandma Fillmore, Charles's mother, who never subscribed to unity principles or any religion really, she was there and she was the underpinning that made sure the family functioned on the human level. She cooked, she cleaned, took care of the kids. So even in that place, there is still, even if our spiritual willingness is going like this, we still need to find some balance with our human willingness. And finally, unity. We move past surrender into an ultimate oneness. And some people say, oh, only Jesus achieved this. I would say the Fillmores came pretty darn close. And I will base this on the following couple stories about them. Myrtle was, as many of you know, the founder and caretaker of Silent Unity. She set that foundation of prayer for the unity movement that has gone on for 120 plus years. She also, when she came to a time when she was clear that her bodily work was done, she made a passage that was just so inspirational because she said her goodbyes. And people said, you look fine. And then she went home and she quietly passed in her sleep sometime later. So the idea that she was willing to let go of her human body because she realized her time was complete is inspirational to me. Charles, on the other hand, resisted that whole process until 3 days before his passing. He had a whole other concept, and that's yet another Sunday talk. But what he had, and I got this from his granddaughter, was he understood the silence in a way that I haven't yet achieved. And she said it wasn't until she was in elementary school that she discovered that not all grandparents went into the silence, because if you ask Charles a question, he'd close his eyes, get quiet, and then open his eyes and give you the answer. And This was how he expressed his willingness. He constantly was in prayer. It said that he prayed probably 8 hours a day. So I don't know how much he slept, but close to a third of his day, perhaps. So there's a place where we come in and we can move through whatever it is life throws at us by letting go of that willfulness and moving into a place of being able to say, not my will, but thine. So this is a picture of Unity early on. As you can see, it's almost a whole city block of buildings. And then, of course, we have Unity Village nowadays. And Unity truly is a worldwide community. I'm really getting a sense of that as we have been coping through this pandemic and contacting each other. And I've been in contact with people in the UK and Australia and just opening my mind to a larger vision of what Unity is. So with that, let us prepare for meditation.
In the silence, there is a sacred place, a secret meeting place. Love is there, and in the silence, where every color blends and every rainbow ends, good is there. In the light now you find that you know peace of mind. And in the silence, your path is paved in gold, and all your dreams unfold. Love is there. Peace is there. Truth is there. God is there.
Now, as we move into our time of meditation, heart to heart, hand to hand, soul to soul, I invite you to just get comfortable. Do a wiggle if you need to. Breathing into the space within your physical body where you feel that connection, where you feel a sense of oneness, where you feel your own divinity, where you feel yourself touch the universal allness. And breathing into this awareness, we ask ourselves the question, what am I willing to be, to have, to do? As with the Fillmores, have you had an idea where your intellect or your understanding say, no way, not me, but something in your heart says, yes, I am willing. And we just breathe into that consciousness. Allow the idea to come forward. And breathing into the silence, we just allow this consciousness to explode into the idea of I am willing. And as my heart attunes to this willingness, to this idea, my intellect comes into understanding. But understanding of its own can do nothing. It needs will to provide the energy. And so I again ask myself, what is it? What am I willing to be, to have, to do? What is mine that is uniquely mine, that is for no one else but me? And for the Fillmore's willingness to listen, to be willing when it became clear that their ideas were not welcome in other churches, to say, we are willing to start our own. We are willing to start a ministry. We are willing to train ministers and leaders. We are willing to use technology to share this message. And we are willing to stand firm through the hard times, knowing that in our willingness, the way will be made clear and easy. And so too for each of us, and indeed for every being on this planet. And breathing again into this consciousness, we give thanks that we have the awareness that we can choose to let go of our willfulness and to become willing. And for this time together, for this opportunity to come onto this journey together, we are so grateful. And so it is, and so it shall be. Amen.